All right, everyone. Welcome today. Thank you for joining us this morning, or wherever you are, whatever time it is around the world. My name is Graham Cornwell. I'm Assistant Dean for Research at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. I'm delighted to welcome you to our very first book launch of the academic year. So welcome. Before we do get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that GW resides on the traditional and ancestral homelands of Piscataway and Anacostia peoples, who served as stewards of the region for generations. So we're kicking off our book launch series today to celebrate the launch of the Cinema of Soviet Kazakhstan, an Uneasy Legacy. And I am especially honored because the author is my friend and colleague and mentor, Professor Peter Rollberg. We're joined by a very esteemed panel to discuss this, and I don't want to take up too much time because I want to turn it over to the experts. But today we have Dean Alyssa Ayers joining us with some introductory remarks. Dr. Birgit Boimers, Alyssa Ayers is the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Professor Birgit Boimers is Professor Emeritus in Film Studies at the University of Aberystwyth in Wales, in the UK. And Marlène Laruelle is Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School, as well as Director of the Central Asia Program. Many other hats, as well as Research Professor of International Affairs at GW. And then finally, our main event. Our author today is Dr. Peter Rollberg, Professor of Slavic Languages, Film Studies, and International Affairs at the George Washington University, and Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research Initiatives at the Elliott School. I just want to flag for those of you joining us that this is, again, our first book launch of the year. We host a very robust series of faculty book launches. Our next one is next week on the 23rd at 4 p.m. Lucia Raffanelli is presenting her work. And we will actually post a link to our upcoming book launches in the chat, so you can be sure to check out what we have coming. But it's a very exciting series, and we're delighted to honor and celebrate the research, the exciting research developments in our faculty. So with that, congratulations, Peter, on an awesome and extremely thorough book. I learned so much about Soviet Kazakhstan, not to mention the cinema. And we've had so many great talks about movies over the years that I've really enjoyed your sort of scholarly perspective here. And I'm happy to turn it over to Dean Alyssa Ayers for her opening comments.
Thank you, Graham, and good morning to those here in the United States. A good evening to those connecting to our conversation from Kazakhstan. I know we have some, and a good afternoon to those elsewhere. As Graham said, my name is Alyssa Ayers, and I'm the Dean of the Elliott School. It is great to see so many people joining for this launch of Professor Peter Rollberg's fascinating Cinema of Soviet Kazakhstan, 1925 to 1991, an Uneasy Legacy. His book is a real treat for cinephiles, obviously, but also for scholars of literature and film, for historians, and for anyone interested in the evolution of a unique national cinema in the 20th century. He offers a comprehensive history of Kazakhstani cinema and its production and its relationship to Russia within the Soviet Union during this period through 1991. So in addition to being a history of Kazakhstani cinema, this detailed historical account is at the same time also an introduction to the most important films of Kazakhstan during each of these decades. He offers synopses and analyses of the aesthetic meaning, as well as a tour through the development of different genre films in the former Soviet Republic. I would also note that the book is a really approachable read for anyone interested in cinema and cultural production more generally. The Cinema of Soviet Kazakhstan traces the twin arcs of both the narrative and visual content of Kazakhstani film, as well as the conditions of its creation in Kazakhstan. So by doing these two things, Professor Rollberg's book offers another way to look at this history, and that is as the evolution of the idea of a Kazakhstani national cinema a process that over these decades during the Soviet period engaged questions of identity and of language policy. In fact, it wasn't until 1958, a meeting of the Communist Party, members voted to shoot all feature films in the Kazakh language, for example, though as Professor Rohlberg points out, this policy decision had some later exceptions. But the tales that he weaves throughout the book here, such as with language policy, these have been seen in so many nationalisms around the world and often serve as a vector for idealized visions of the nation, cultural symbols in which nationalists often locate the so-called spirit of a people. And in the 20th century, cinema can serve as the visual and narrative bearer of stories. So we see epics, or particular tales of heroes, or noted historical episodes that come to highlight the sense of a national culture. And as Professor Rohlberg points out, Kazakhstani filmmakers were in some sense defining their sense of their national culture via film, pursuing the question of national authenticity in their cinema. So in this book, Cinema of Soviet Kazakhstan, I've got my copy here, 1925 to 1991, he gives the reader a wonderful tour of the questions Kazakhstani filmmakers have asked over this nearly 70-year period. The themes that have been most appreciated by the viewing public, what this all meant for Kazakhstani film as an industry, and how this all in turn played into the dialogue between the Russian center of the Soviet Union and, in this case, the Kazakhstani periphery. This is obviously a cultural history that has consequences for Kazakhstan's later independence, and there is another volume in the works, which I hope we will see soon. I'd like to note that a deep engagement with culture, whether film or literature or material cultures, lends important and interesting insights to the study of international affairs more generally. Every place, every region, every state, or a local level has its own specificity. So gaining an understanding of the stories that cultures tell about themselves and how that changes, what is revived, what is appealed to the past, all of this helps us understand what can often be driving assumptions of belonging and national identity. So in this sense, the humanities contribute a great deal to our regional and area knowledge across the world. So I know you will all enjoy today's discussion to celebrate the publication of the Cinema of Soviet Kazakhstan, 1925 to 91. I hope you'll all join me in congratulating Professor Rohlberg, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Well, let me continue now. Thank you, Dean Iris, for your great introduction. It will be my pleasure to moderate this book launch discussion. Let me say a few more words about our author and our discussant and how we will be organizing the event. Peter has had a lot of different hats at the GW. He served as director of the GW Honors Program. He was director of the Film Studies Program, and he was director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies when I was just arriving there. But he also had a lot of other great publications, including the A to Z of Russian and Soviet cinema and the Modern Encyclopedia of East Slavic, Baltic, and Central Asian literatures. And as Dean Iris was saying, I would really insist on the key role that Peter has been playing at the school in bringing culture into the field of international relations. And I think that's something quite unique that we have here at the Elliott School, thanks to Peter, this ability to bring culture into the global international affair and strategic perspective field. And especially at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, Peter has been playing a key role helping me bringing Central Asian culture into the discussion of Central Asia today that we had at the Central Asia program. I read the book when it was just a manuscript, and I can tell you it's really a wonderful, comprehensive work that is offering unique insight into Kazakh, but also into global Central Asian and Soviet culture. It's written with style, and it's written with both empathy and critical distance, and that's really a wonderful mix of perspectives. So, and as it was just said, we are all waiting for the second volume on post-Soviet Kazakh cinema, and I know many of our colleagues in Kazakhstan are also waiting for that. So what I would like to do now is to give the floor to Peter for him summarizing the main thesis of the book for about 15 minutes. Then I will introduce our discussant and give her the floor. And then I will moderate the Q&A. I invite people to use the chat and the Q&A box. And I will then after kind of pick some question and try to set as many as we can into the time that will be left for us. So once again, welcome, congratulations, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Thank you, Dean Aris, and thank you, Graham, for your kind words. And this is really a wonderful occasion for me. I'm deeply honored because I know that, of course, the book in a school that is eminently political is somewhat on the margins thematically. And yet I think that my time as director of IRIS with colleagues such as Marlene, it actually sensitized me to political aspects of culture in a way that I wasn't before. And so I think that is also reflected in the book. It's not a political book. It's not meant to be entirely political, but it does have political sensitivities in it, and they are reflected in the analyses of the various films and of the time. So in a way, you can read this as a history of Soviet Kazakhstan through the lens of cinema. Let me say in the beginning a few things why I actually undertook this. So my last big publication was the Historical Dictionary of Russian and Soviet Cinema, 800 pages, 600 articles. And what distinguished it from other encyclopedias was that I gave quite a bit of attention to the non-Russian cinematographies, to the non-Russian film cultures, and that includes Georgian in particular, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and so on. And this is one important aspect for those who are not so familiar with Soviet cinema who need to know that. This is part of Soviet civilization in that after Lenin made this famous statement that for us Bolsheviks, cinema is the most important of all arts, the Soviet society actually invested enormous amounts of money, resources, and logistical capacities into building film industries in each of the 15 Soviet republics. And that meant that each of the capitals would actually get their own studio. And this was normally a feature film studio, a documentary film studio, newsreels, and animation in some cases. And in some cases, like for instance in Kazakhstan, these were actually put together into one. The production volume of these studios, whether they were in Minsk or in Tashkent or in Tbilisi or Yerevan, was actually relatively small. It was usually between 3 and 5 full-length feature films per year. But this also became the context for the development of a national cinematic thinking, of a national cinematic culture. Some of this started in the 1920s, in other republics in the 30s and 40s, depending on the economic conditions and so on. Now, after the encyclopedia that I mentioned, where I really gave this encyclopedic look at all of them together, I wanted to try one case study, one historical analysis of a film culture that had its specifics, and that was basically the objective scholarly goal of finding out how does it actually work. We know that Moscow was the power in charge of all cinemas, of all these national studios. They were the ones who had the last word, the last decision, whether a film could be released or not. And so it went so far, for example, that when a movie theater was built in Almaty at the time, and they actually incurred too much waste. There was too much money was actually wasted. Stalin himself decided, who was supposed to come up for those costs. So this is the kind of centralization, the central model of culture that I'm talking about. At the same time, Moscow could not determine in absolute terms what was actually happening in each of these republics. And that is the reason why we have distinct national cinema cultures, cinematographies in these republics. For example, in Georgia, where film culture became so sophisticated and so incredibly powerful that Georgian films in the 1960s and 70s were shown on all major festivals throughout the world. This, of course, is not the same in every republic, but I have an interest in Georgian cinema, but I did pick Kazakhstani cinema, or the cinema of Kazakhstan, because it appealed to me aesthetically. This was an important aspect of it, in that something spoke to me, the characters, the conflicts, the landscapes, the music, and so on. And so one of the first surprises that I actually experienced when I went into this area of Kazakhstani Soviet cinema was how beautiful it was, and beautiful in a very peculiar way in its imagery. And this is one thing, for example, that is rarely said about Kazakhstani cinema, about the cinema of Kazakhstan, is that it has a distinguished school of cinematography. There were cinematographers such as Mikhail Aranashev, Askat Ashrapov, both Russians and Kazakh nationals, and they contributed an incredible visual quality to the cinema of Kazakhstan, starting in the 1950s and all the way until today. Another quality that I had not expected, didn't know anything about, was the music. The film scores were written by extraordinary Kazakhstani film composers, not just film composers. And the most famous one, Nurgisat Lendiyev, is really we could say an expert on the national instruments in Kazakhstan. On Dombra, he played it himself, and he contributed just wonderfully energetic and melodious scores to great Kazakhstani films such as My Name is Kaja, and so on. So that adds, of course, national flavor. The landscapes, the visual aspects, and the music, these are important parts of cinema, apart from the conflicts and the values and so on. So these virtuosi of cinema, actually, who are not, in the forefront, who are not, the most famous ones at the same time, they actually made sure that the films were not just Soviet, but also Kazakh. And this was one of my questions: to what extent was it possible to actually create a distinct Kazakhstani cinema within the Soviet framework? And my finding, if I may say this in very rough terms, was that it was possible, and it was done to a surprisingly large extent. And this is particularly important for the identity of Kazakhstani culture, Kazakhstani cinema, and so on. A third factor that I did not expect and that really surprised me was the genre diversity. And if you have a studio like Mosfilm or Lenfilm, which produce between 20 and 40 feature films a year, it's easy to have genre variety. In a case like Kazakh Film Studio, which had usually between 2 to 5 releases a year, it is difficult to create genre diversity, and directors had to wait for years until they got a chance to make a film. And still you can see certain trends, and one is Kazakhstan made some of the most wonderful, funny, irreverent children's films. And so the most famous one of them, My Name is Kaja, I mentioned already, by Abdullah Karsakbayev. It wasn't even meant to be a hit at all. It was just released as a regular film, and then Kazakhs actually showed how much they loved the humor in this film. It was a little bit this kind of anti-authoritarian humor, like in Pippi Longstocking films from Sweden, and just in a different way, of course, on a Kazakhstani background. But this type of inner freedom of a child who clashes with the authorities, and yet in the end the outcome is a good and constructive one, that appealed to so many Kazakhs, and it became what we call a sleeper hit for many years. And I think every Kazakh has seen that film, My Name is Koja. Another film genre that I had no idea Kazakhstan would actually be so interested in is sports films. And these are feature films about athletes, in particular boxers. So starting with a 1970 film, The White Square, about a young man who becomes a boxer and who's coached by an aging boxer who is a recovering alcoholic. This was so impressive to me. The director, Sharif Besimbayev, then his name didn't say anything to me. He was really kind of in the second row of Kazakhstani directors, and yet he has made so many wonderful films. So these kind of discoveries were really important. And of course, another genre that I knew about before, but the Kazakhs did something very special with it, is called the Eastern. The Eastern is a reference, of course, to the Western, but in this case, it is referring to the 1920s, to the fighting between the Red Army units and the so-called Basmachi, which were anti-communist units interested in the old Islamic order and who did not want communism, who did not want the Soviets. And of course, in Soviet films, they're described as crooks and criminals. But in Kazakhstani films, in Kazakhstani Easterns, their role was different. And there was one film in particular, the 1966 A Worrisome Morning, that actually showcased some enemies of the Soviet order, some basmachi, who were intelligent and who were sophisticated and had good reasons why they actually were resisting the communization of Kazakhstan. And the main character in this film is a commissar by the name of Baitenov. He is an intellectual. He's someone who fought in 1916, so before the Soviets came, against the Tsar, against the draft of the Kazakhs to World War I. That was a big upheaval. And so now his former comrades from that 1916 upheaval are his enemies, because they were with him against the Tsar, but now they're against him and against communism, and he has to come to terms with that. And that film is such an unusual take. It's of course full of action, you know, and so on, as Easterns are supposed to be, like Westerns, but it's not a children's film at all, and it shows a depth of specific Kazakh perception of the world that is quite amazing. I have selected a brief 2-minute clip from it. Diane, can we show that? Is it possible? Let me just say what is interesting about this scene and why I selected it. He is this commissar, the commissar who is in doubt about his communist loyalty, and a fighter joins him and he asks, what are you doing here? And he says, well, you know, I'm looking at these drawings on the stone, so I want to study our past. And here he makes a real interesting statement. He says, this communist commissar, these are the traces left by our ancestors. There can be no future without the past. He who remembers is alive. So this is the film as it was released in 1966, both in a Kazakh and in a Russian version. The director, Karzakbayev, had to fight very hard for this film, but he actually finally got it through. And it was also a sleeper hit, and it is today viewed as one of the best Kazakhstani films ever. Now, what is the part that I did not know about and that surprised me? In 1983, 17 years after the initial release, a redacted version was released. And this is something typical of Soviet cinema and typical of Kazakhstani cinema as well. Films that were released, let's say, in 1938 or in 1954 were re-released 10 or 20 or 30 years later in a different redaction. I will always wanted to know, what is it that actually was redacted here? What has been changed? And here's this scene that I just, you know, showed you like a snippet from. The dialogue was completely changed. So in this new version from 1983, the fighter who joins Baitenov, he says, our ancestors used to hunt animals, and we are hunting humans. To which the commissar replies, we are hunting those humans who have turned into animals. So you can tell that the redaction changed the nature of the initial statement completely. The initial statement was one of respect for the ancestors, respect for the old culture, saying that we need to know and embrace our past in order to actually have a future, whereas the redacted statement actually made a very brutal justification of why the basmachi need to be hunted down like animals. So this shows you how politically sensitive the subject of cinema was, and how such deep intrusions into the fabric of the film and of the films was actually taken for granted and made possible. One more motivation was that I found it irritating how the view of Soviet film history was always kind of centered on the Russian Federation. This is not a statement against Russia or Russians per se, but the type of structure of cultural production as it was established in the Soviet Union. When you look, for example, there were two Soviet film encyclopedias, huge tomes. And if you look at the number of lines given to Russian filmmakers and also foreign filmmakers, and then to Kazakh filmmakers, there are 6 major directors in Kazakhstani Soviet cinema. That is Shaken Aymanov, who really was the founder of it. That is Sultan Ahmet Hodzhikov, who made probably the most beautiful Kazakhstani Soviet film, Kuzhibek, the Silken Maiden. Majid Begalin, that is Yefim Aron and Alexander Karpov, and these, and of course Abdullah Karsakbayev. Each of them, except Aymanov, has about 5 lines in the encyclopedia compared to 20, 30 lines for others, and there was nothing said about their creative, artistic individuality. So one of the goals for me writing this book was to actually find the right words, the thorough analysis to actually characterize these virtuosi of Kazakhstani cinema and do them justice as artists, because each of them had actually a very difficult life. So, for example, Begalin and Hodzhikov were both injured in World War II, severely injured, and they made their films with enormous physical, under enormous physical duress. Aymanov actually tragically died in 1970 in a car accident in Moscow, and so on. These directors were able to make maybe 2, maybe 5 full-length feature films in the way that they wanted to make them. And so in order to kind of reconstruct their potential, their outlook, their aesthetics, what they actually wanted to do in cinema, that was my way of doing justice to them. And that's why the book actually has become quite voluminous, about 450 pages, because it contains very detailed analyses of these directors and other directors' films in order to show what an originality there was at work, what original filmmakers these were, and how they actually gave their all to create this oeuvre for their national cinema. The last thing I want to say here is that what Aymanov and Begalin and others did starting in the mid-1950s and all the way into the 1960s, before everything basically fell apart aesthetically, was they created a genuine trust between Kazakhs, the Kazakh population, millions of Kazakhstanis, and their films. And so when a Kazakhstani film was released, the comedy that I mentioned before, Our Dear Doctor, but also other films that were made by non-Kazakh directors, such as Девушка Jigit, the Jigit Girl, which was a huge hit throughout the Soviet Union with like 30 million viewers. They actually created and maintained that trust. And what we have then as a result of these various processes in the 70s and 80s is a division between mass cinema and art house cinema. And what we see today in festivals, of course, is art house cinema, in which Kazakhstan is very strong, but that is not actually the subject of this book. My book is really about Soviet Kazakh cinema, and I try to do it justice and the artistic quality of it justice. Recently, I discovered something that really surprised me. A young documentary filmmaker from Nur-Sultan, Yevgeny Lumpov, he began a search for one of the lost old Kazakhstani Soviet films, Majid Begalin's It Happened in Shugla, 1955. I had not seen that film because it was nowhere to be seen. It was nowhere to be found. It was really impossible. And he invested his own money and a lot of time and effort, and he found a copy and restored it and organized the first screening in Almaty in Kazakhstan, which was attended by the luminaries of Kazakh cinema, Asanali Yashimov and others, who all remembered it and then hadn't seen it for 70 years, almost 70 years, and now were able to actually give it a new kind of assessment, a new kind of justice. To me, this engagement of a young film enthusiast is a sign of a new authentic interest in the legacy of Kazakh cinema. It will take such an enthusiasm of cinephiles such as Lumpov, film historians of the older generation such as Ravshan Ospanova, critics such as Gulnara Bikeyeva, and an open-hearted audience to rediscover this cinema which is, yes, it is Soviet in its political essence, but it's also profoundly Kazakh in preserving Kazakh traditions. I hope that my efforts will contribute to a better, deeper understanding and fair evaluation of the Soviet Kazakhstani legacy, or as Commissar Baitenov said in a worrisome morning in the original version, there can be no future without the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this really wonderful insight into your inner motivation for writing this book and this great example. And I think you did justice to Soviet Kazakh cinema. And I know in Kazakhstan, people are really impressed that someone not from Kazakhstan has been able to study with such in-depth and empathy their cultural production. And I really hope the book will be translated in Russian and or in Kazakh. Let me now turn to our discussant, Birgit Böhmer. Birgit is also a specialist of Russian and Central Asia cinema. She published a book called A History of Cinema. She edited a volume called The Companion to Russian Cinema and Cinema in Central Asia, Rewriting Cultural Histories. And she's also the editor of our two main journals on Russian and Soviet cinema, Kino Kultura, and studies in Russian and Soviet cinema. So Birgit, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me here to participate in this book launch. And I would like to begin by complimenting also Peter on this enormous achievement. Dean Ayres and Peter himself have already talked about the content of the book, what this book does. And let me take this opportunity to create a somewhat wider context for the work and address a couple of questions that the book brings up and that will maybe help us contextualize it in different ways. So it is, as we have already heard and seen, a work that is the first devoted to Kazakh cinema of the Soviet era. It is the first book devoted to one of the Central Asian republics' works in cinema as a separate history. And I think that is of huge importance, and I will come back to that later. We have seen an interest in Central Asia basically starting since, let's say, since independence, so since 1991. But that interest has not really been articulated in scholarship right from the start, and it has taken a while for scholarship, for publishers to actually pick up an area that is still quite fragile, let me say. So why is that so? Why should we focus on Central Asia? Why should we turn to an area that is maybe not in political sciences, maybe not in history, but that is certainly in cultural studies and particularly in cinema, somewhat a stepchild, and remains a stepchild of what? Of something, of the Soviet era. So that is one of the questions that I would like to address here. So we have seen a few publications on cinema of Central Asia, including the volume that I co-edited, of course, with the amazing Gulnara Abikeyeva, whose work on the promotion not only of Kazakh cinema, but also of Central Asian cinema, starting from the mid-1990s, has been phenomenal. And I think without her input, we as scholars, and I speak for a kind of broader base of scholarship, I think we would be nowhere near where we are now, because she has also done an incredible amount of making accessible and of facilitating, of bringing to the forefront of attention, not only Kazakh, but also other Central Asian filmmakers and artists, visual artists as well. And I think that's also of great significance, certainly for the contemporary scene. We have a book by Rico Isaacs on Kazakh cinema after 1991. So we have seen individual studies in book form and article form devoted to cinema after independence, because that is the period where we can neatly say, okay, we're dealing with Kazakh cinema, we're dealing with Kyrgyz cinema, Tajik cinema, Uzbek cinema, and I leave out Turkmen cinema for the obvious reason of its absence in this count. So we have seen publications addressed to what happened since independence, in particular investigations about the so-called New Wave, the Kazakh New Wave, which is all very, very important. But ultimately, we are all addressing a question about the timescale, about trying to define a cinematography as a national cinematography from the point of view of independence. But it came from somewhere. It came from a Soviet context. And how do we do that Soviet context and that Soviet past justice in assessing those works? So I want to kind of group here around three terms of refocus, reframe, and retrain. So refocusing, we refocus, we adjust our lens, we look at the national cinematography of the Central Asian republics, but this has also happened in other areas. For example, in trying to address Czech and Slovak cinematic history as separate. Whether that is a useful or not so useful thing is a different issue. It's a different question. But I think it is important to address the way in which we can change lenses. Whether we lose or we gain by doing that, that is to each individual work, to each individual piece of scholarship. But likewise, we are in the process now of looking separately at Central Asian cinematic histories. And this is where I think Peter's work comes in as a major contribution in doing that. And I hope that at some point we will also have a rewriting of the history of Kyrgyz cinema, of Tajik cinema, of Uzbek cinema. Because the work, Peter's book, is not only a milestone in making accessible those narratives in a coherent way, but also contextualizing them and trying to understand and come to terms with the engagement or disengagement with Soviet discourses that were prominent at a given time. So it facilitates an understanding not only of the cinematography, not only of the cultural impact of these works, but also of the historical and political context in which they were created, both Kazakh and Soviet. So, reframe. We address national identity first and foremost. National identity was one of the key terms that you would find in almost every second publication, scholarly publication after independence. National identity, it's of course a key concept, the national identity of Kazakhstan. But then just for a moment, let us pause about where that concept of nationhood came from, and that it is actually and ultimately a Soviet construct in itself. So the beginning of a national cinema, which is relevant for debates and not only of the past, but also of the present. Because when we look at national cinema, national production, national film production, it is a key term that we use when we talk about contemporary Russian film production, but also when we look at Central Asia. And when we then turn to agendas of co-production and this whole discourse of co-producing with other countries and where your own national identity stands. And I will give one example here, and that is that in Russia, Russia has the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation has subsidized co-production only for majority co-production. So that is when Russia is the key player in the production. And only for 2 years, it has been possible to get subsidies, state subsidies for minority co-production. The first example of how that works, when you take away your national concerns for a moment and you think about what you want to achieve, namely to talk to international audiences and to bring across a content and to package your own country into that product, then look at compartment number 6. A film directed by a Finnish filmmaker, Juho Kuosmanen, which won the Grand Prix at Cannes this year and which is the first Russian minority co-production. And I can only say to that, well done. So it is a question also of thinking broader and wider, of thinking how you get your films integrated into other production mechanisms, but thereby also into other discourses, into other areas, into other fora. So I think for Kazakhstan, there is something interesting there happening with its turn towards the East, including for co-production. And thirdly, retraining. You have mentioned such a wide range in your presentation, Peter, of the filmmakers, the outstanding Kazakh filmmakers. You have even more in your book. And where do they all come from? Well, yes, they come from Kazakhstan. And where have they all trained? 99.9% in Moscow at the Film Institute. So this is something that is also very, very relevant. To what extent training has impacted on the way in which these filmmakers engage with their material, in which they form their discourse, which by training already is supposed to be part of a Soviet discourse. And how does training adapt today? What do countries like Kazakhstan do in order to shift the focus, to take the training back into their own hands? And of the Central Asian republics, one has to say that Kazakhstan is, of course, most advanced in that respect in terms of its international engagement, in terms of creating film schools and having already had in place several film academies before independence, but of taking back that responsibility of training a new generation of filmmakers. So I think those are all important and interesting aspects that are enhanced through the knowledge that we gain from the book that Peter has presented here, which, as you know, everybody has said, I'm really very, very impressed also about the accessibility. And I do hope that you will be able to teach, but maybe other people will also be able to teach courses on Kazakh cinema or Central Asian cinema and draw on your book as a textbook, because it is so well written, so such an easy and pleasant read, as well as a thoughtful piece of work, of course, that I hope that will work, and is probably also helped by the fact that we have a great number of films that now become increasingly accessible for classroom use, especially of the older period of the Soviet period. So to conclude, where do we go from here? Well, I hope for my part that you might do what you have done just for Kazakh cinema and film history to some of the other Central Asian republics. And I'm thinking here in particular of Kyrgyzstan or maybe Uzbekistan, which I think have an equal wealth of material there. And I hope that somebody will turn their attention to this in due course. And of course, it is also significant to look at Kazakhstan in the Central Asian context, but also in a more global context. And to go back to its role as one of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union. So it has always been a close partner of the Soviet Union. It has also been a partner of the Russian Federation, both in cultural exchanges and in political and economic ways. But I think it is important still today, when particularly you look at distribution mechanisms today, at production mechanisms, that a lot of the films are made both for a Russian and a Kazakh market simultaneously, and that Russian distribution is also has its hands in very much in the Kazakh distribution system. So there is still a kind of a very tense relationship going on there. But one of the things that, of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union has also meant, apart from the independence, when you look at it from the point of view of the Russian Federation, which has just lost all its little kind of film studios, is that we see an interesting development in Russia today, which I would just like to sort of use as a concluding note here, a development that seems to have had an impact also on what the Russian Federation is doing at the moment, namely to increase the role of regional studios and of studios no longer in the old republics, which they have lost, but to build studios in the autonomous republics and regions, and to focus film production, for example, in autonomous republics like Yakutia-Sakha or Tatarstan or Bashkortostan, and in other areas. And I think that in itself may also be an interesting kind of take to bear in mind when using the book as an example of, see, this is what how the Soviet Union interacted with one of its satellite republics. So I will conclude on that and hand back to Marlene for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Birgit, for these great comments. We have a little bit more than 10, around 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more if we can exceed the time. Peter, I would like to ask you 2 questions coming from the room and then give you the floor back, and maybe you can also answer to Birgit or comments on Birgit's proposals and ideas. One of the questions we have from the room is about this kind of regional identity component and the interaction or competition you may have been noticing between Soviet Kazakh cinema and the cinema of other Central Asian Republic. How in Soviet Kazakh cinema, this kind of both competition and partnership with other Central Asian cultural elements, how is that frame, and could you see some elements where clearly the Soviet Kazakh cinema was trying to dissociate itself from the other Central Asian cinemas? So that's one question. The second one is kind of continuing what you mentioned at the end about this young critic now restoring all the films. What is your perception of the Kazakh societies today in relations to their Soviet cinema? Do you feel the society is ready and interested in rediscovering this Soviet Kazakh cinema, or is that something that is still kind of difficult to interpret around all this question, or what that's really Kazakh or just purely Soviet, what was really ours, what was kind of broader Soviet? So what do you think is the general perception of the public opinion in Kazakhstan toward their own cultural past? And I will give you the floor on these 2 big questions and maybe some also answers to Birgit's comment.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you very, very much, Birgit Boimers, for your remarks. And of course, you're looking at it also in a typological manner, in that, you know, other small cinematographies, small cinema cultures or minority cultures are actually striving to make their footprint and to get their creative energies released in cinema. And we've seen really remarkable results, you know, from minor you know, studios in Russia, and you have worked on that in a quite exemplary manner. So I think this is really very important in, as I said, as a typological issues, and yet one cannot actually say that all these national cinemas actually reacted in the same way. For example, Georgia was very autonomous for the longest time, and the more prestigious their films were, the more prizes they won. And Federico Fellini and so on, they all loved Georgian cinema. It's amazing to read about this in the 1960s and 70s. Ingmar Bergman knew about Uzbek cinema. I mean, these are things that are all part of the Soviet legacy. And of course, Birgit is right in emphasizing that all national cinema cultures were educated by the Soviet Center, by the Moscow State Film School, the oldest film school in the world, founded in 1919, VGIK in Moscow. And while it was politically and ideologically restrictive for a long time, it was also part of the liberation of the 1980s, right? And so the new Kazakh wave was Rashid Nugmanov and Amirkulov and so on, Ardak Amirkulov and so on, and they were actually liberated by the experience of liberation in this perestroika Moscow that was so powerful also in the film world in VGIK, and they brought it back to the more cautious and conservative Kazakhstan in the 1980s. The question of interaction with other Central Asian cinematographies, that's a kind of difficult one. I would say that for some time, especially when Aymanov, Bigalin, Khojikov were basically lost in the 1970s, what Kazakh Film Studio did, they invited film directors from other studios, including from Moscow, but also from Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan and so on, to actually direct films. And some of them were masterpieces. For example, one film called The Wild One, about a little boy who raises a wolf cub and then has to really find out that nature cannot be completely tamed, and has to find out in a terrible manner. This film from 1973 is one of the masterpieces. Some people say, well, it was made by a Kyrgyz director, and to which I answer, but it was based on a Kazakh short story by Mukhtar Awezov. It had mostly Kazakh talent in it, and so on, based and so on. So, and there's nothing wrong with having such co-productions, which I think are quite interesting. But each of the Central Asian republics had their own tradition. They had their own emphasis, depending also, frankly, on the political leadership. If the political leadership, was cultured and, was reading books and interested in music and so on, then they would actually allow more kind of aesthetic experimentation in their film studio, for example, in Kyrgyzstan. And if it was more corrupt, or if it was more doctrinaire, then it was a lot harder for them to work there. But the most interesting part for me is the influence of Western European cinemas on a Kazakhstani film, and that especially French cinema, with the Kazakh New Wave. The name Kazakh New Wave is not by chance, has been chosen because it resembles the Nouvelle Vague from France, and this kind of auteur approach was something that the Kazakhs very much wanted to imitate. And interestingly, those stylish films, even though they were more shown on festivals and so on, it still works with Kazakh material. It really, has, and I think no other Central Asian republic has actually produced that kind of symbiosis between Kazakhstani national material and foreign aesthetics, including Western European foreign aesthetics. That is, to me, one of the real phenomena. There is a question about what films I do recommend. It depends, of course, on your taste. I mean, on YouTube, you can find quite a bit, and the more you find, the more will actually be given and shown to you. Knowledge of the Russian language is important in order to make sense of it. Few films, unfortunately, there are some that have English subtitles, but it's very difficult to find them. And again, I want to say there is a genre that the Kazakhs are incredibly innovative in, and that's the thriller. The thrillers were actually made already in the 1970s, and I personally like this genre. When it has a moral basis, when it is well filmed. Film is movement. It needs car chases and so on. And so while we have a tradition in Soviet Kazakhstani cinema of let's say, detective films, as they were called, thrillers. Then in the post-Soviet era, we have a wonderfully talented director like Akan Satayev, who made a film that for the first time actually brought millions of Kazakhs back to the movie theaters. It was called Racketeer. It was released in 2007. And again, every Kazakh adult has actually watched it. And from that point onwards, we have these really dynamic Martin Scorsese inspired thrillers. And I think that's a great tradition. By the way, because film is so expensive in Kazakhstan, it costs about $800,000 to make a full-length feature film on a professional studio level. There are some directors, like, for example, Jana Isabayeva. She was our guest in Iris a couple of years ago, who can make a film also for 50,000 and 70,000, but that is some magic that I don't fully understand. But then what about talented people who do not get into the Kazakh film school, Zhurgenovka, who do not get into the studio and have no connections? Well, they have started actually to make films on YouTube, and they are so funny and so wild. They are often irreverent, sometimes using very low standard language and so on, but they also bring a great deal of realism to the small screen. And so YouTube here has become, I would say, a creative a context in which young people can actually try out their talents. And now, even because some money is being made on that, now even professional actors and actresses are participating in that. The final thing I mentioned, Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese is actually in charge of a series of restored films, the World Cinema Project, for which he has found funding throughout the world. And he himself introduces these films and speaks about them. And of course, Martin Scorsese himself is one of the great American directors of our era. And one Kazakhstani film was included. It's called The Revenge. So somebody asked which film I would recommend. I think that's also available on YouTube, subtitled The Revenge by Yermek Shinarbayev, 1989. It is actually available in the United States on DVD as part of Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project. Scorsese is speaking with great respect and admiration about this film and its director. And I asked Shinarbayev, I said, well, surely this must actually create a sensation that, a Kazakhstani film has been included in this project, and Scorsese is praising it and so on and so on. And he said, not a word. This was really almost not noticed. And of course, this is part of the problem that this Soviet Kazakhstani film legacy, even in its strongest parts, is not sufficiently promoted. Only the state can do it. I mean, you can have private sponsors, of course, but in order to do it in a systematic, professional manner to restore these films, this legacy, you need state funding and you need professionals who are actually engaged in that. And I think the fact that, I mean, it's the world notices, and unfortunately in Kazakhstan hardly anybody notices such an event like The Revenge, this beautiful philosophical deep film that really is also accessible. Somebody, I think I'm very grateful for you mentioning that the book is accessible to non-specialists. This was one of my goals. I wanted to write it in a language that is accessible to everybody. Well, most Kazakhstani art house films are accessible to everybody, quite frankly. They're not like, hyper sophisticated, games of guessing what symbols mean this and that. They're actually great stories. And so when you watch the films of Darizhan Amirbayev or of Yermek Shinarbayev and so on, these are films that can be watched. You need patience, of course. For genuine art, you need a little bit of patience and discipline. Once you bring that, you will be richly rewarded. But in order to take care of the entire legacy of Kazakhstani cinema, I think the state needs to invest money, infrastructure, logistics.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your... Yes, Birgit, would you like to add something?
Add something tiny little to that, which I think is absolutely right. But I think the wonderful thing is that Kazakh film actually has the equipment to digitize films, and they do it, and they do make sure that films are preserved. And there are several collections that have been already produced to make sure that these films are in good condition. And I think it is also one of the very few countries where Gosfilmafond, which is the state archive, the Soviet state, well, Soviet era state archive for films, is actually looking at transferring the negatives back to Kazakhstan, because it's the only country in Central Asia which has good enough conditions to store those films. So we may not hear about that, but there are actually things that are happening, even if they are in the background. And I would just like to say that because it's something that we don't find in the other republics. And I think it's very important, as you quite rightly say, that we look after the heritage of those films and the fact that they are well preserved for future generations and do not disappear on rubbish heaps. So thank you.
No, thank you. This is very important. And actually, this digital project was for a while accessible through the internet. Now it no longer is. So I don't know what happened there. But of course, it would be great if any sort of financial issues would be left aside, and if this could be made accessible for free to anybody who wants to. Then there's a question I see in the chat. Marlene, can I answer that? Is that okay?
Of course, I wanted to propose you.
So it's about how were Kazakh movies received in Soviet central newspapers, and to what degree were they censored? Yes, they were censored, depending on the time. For example, in the mid-1960s, when Khrushchev was just ousted and Brezhnev came in, there were 2-3 years of liberalism in the Soviet movie industry that included the national republics, and suddenly a film like that of Kasabayev, Where Is Some Morning, could be released. And then later on, it was getting tougher again and harder to do that. But I do have to say that many Kazakh films were reviewed, and sometimes quite intensely, in Izvestia, even in Pravda, and so on. Of course, mostly the politically important films, but also the films that had aesthetic merit. So Kazakhstani cinema was not neglected by the center. And as I mentioned before, some films, such as The End of the Ataman, they were really blockbusters. They had, if you translate this into today's terms, 30 million viewers, that means $300 million in box office results. That's quite a bit. And the old generation of Kazakhstani filmmakers, they were also always interested in maintaining that. They wanted to make films for millions of people. Let me just give you one example. Shakin Aymanov, the founder of Kazakhstani film, he made a beautiful film called Land of the Fathers, about an old man in 1945 who takes his little grandson to go to a place near Leningrad where his son has actually perished in World War II. And the goal is to bring home his remains. That's an old Kazakhstani tradition, to bring home the remains of a loved one and bury them in the father's land. That's where the title comes from. And that film, based on a screenplay by Olzhas Suleimanov, the great poet, is really one of the best Kazakhstani films ever made. And unfortunately, people did not want to see it. When it was released in 1966, movie theaters were largely empty. Aymanov won a prize for it and so on, but it was too sophisticated, it was too artistic, and he was devastated and vowed to never make a film of this kind of auteur artistic type again. And the next film he made was a popular comedy that, of course, again brought millions to the movie theaters. So that generation was interested in having mass audiences. Later on, in the 80s and also now, we have this typical split, which is actually typical of all modern countries, in that you have films that are massively popular, such as the comedies of Nurtas Adambayev, Kilinka Sabina, and so on. There are dozens of them, and people love them. And then there are art house films, and they're watched just by very few cinephiles. And unfortunately, that model seems to have stabilized and seems to have become the one that is now that has been established here.
Thank you so much, Peter. I like your comment about the Kazakh movies having great stories, right? Because Kazakhstan is coming from a nomadic culture, and in nomadic culture, you need storytellers, right? That's how culture is surviving in nomadic conditions. So that was a great way to kind of summarize what your books is bringing to our general knowledge of Kazakhstan beyond the only the movie aspect. So it's time already for us to conclude. I wanted to thank everybody for being with us today for this first book launch of the school, Elliott School book launch of the new academic year, still online, but hopefully soon in person. Wanted to thank Dean Iris for being with us today, Graham for opening, Birgit for your great comments, and Peter, of course. Congratulations to you for the book. It's really a great moment to celebrate, and you can see all the new direction, people asking about your translation in Russian and Kazakh, people asking you to write the second volume on post-Soviet cinema or other volumes on Soviet, Kyrgyz or Uzbek cinema, so you have work for the decades to come. Thank you all for being with us today. Hope to see you very soon for all the Elliott School events. And once again, Peter, congratulations. And thank you, everybody. Wishing you good health and hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Bye.